from the MDGs to the SDGs. Operationalizing sustainable development. When historians look back at 2015, they will likely note that it was a watershed year for sustainable development, as the MDGs expired and were replaced with SDGs, or Global Goals for Sustainable Development, as they became known. The international community embarked on a new path to actually operationalize sustainable development after decades of grappling with exactly how to define the concept. There is broad agreement that the MDGs provided a focal point for governments on which to hinge policies and official development assistance or foreign aid to alleviate poverty, and a rallying point for NGOs to hold governments and the UN system accountable. In fact, it could be argued that MDGs saved the lives of millions and improved conditions for many more. As the 2015 Millennium Development Goals Report indicated, extreme poverty has declined significantly. In 1990, nearly half of the population in the developing world lived on less than $1.25 a day. That proportion dropped to 14% in 2015. Globally, the number of people living in extreme poverty declined more than half, falling from 1.9 billion in 1990 to 836 million in 2015. The proportion of undernourished people in the developing regions fell by almost half since 1990, from 23.3% in 1990 to 92 to 12.9% in 2014 to 2016. The primary school net enrollment rate in developing regions reached 91% in 2015, up from 83% in 2000. In Southern Asia, only 74 girls were enrolled in primary schools for every 100 boys in 1990. In 2013, 103 girls were enrolled for every 100 boys. In 2015, women made up 41% of paid workers outside the agricultural sector, an increase from 35% in 1990. The number of deaths of children under 5 has declined from 12.7 million in 1990 to just over 6 million in 2015 globally. Since 1990, the mortality ratio has declined by 45% worldwide, including a decline of 64% in Southern Asia and 49% in Sub-Saharan Africa. Since HIV infections fell by approximately 40% between 2000 and 2013, from an estimated 3.5 million cases to 2.1 million. Over 6.2 million malaria deaths were averted between 2000 and 2015, primarily of children under 5 years of age in Sub-Saharan Africa. Between 2000 and 2013, tuberculosis prevention, diagnosis, and treatment interventions saved an estimated 37 million lives. The tuberculosis mortality rate fell by 45%. 2.6 billion people have gained access to improved drinking water since 1990, and 2.1 billion people have gained access to improved sanitation. Globally, 147 countries have met the drinking water target, 95 countries have met the sanitation target, and 77 countries have met both. The proportion of urban population living in slums in the developing regions fell from approximately 39.4% in 2000 to 29.7% in 2014. Nevertheless, the MDGs have been criticized for being too narrow. The 8 MDGs failed to consider the root causes of poverty and gender inequality, many of the underlying environmental issues, and the holistic nature of development. The goals made no mention of human rights, not specifically addressed nor specifically addressed economic development. The MDGs were considered goals for developing countries to achieve with financial assistance from industrialized states. In addition, although significant achievements have been made on many of the MDG targets, progress has been uneven across regions and countries, leaving significant gaps. Millions of people have been left behind, especially the poorest and those disadvantaged because of their sex, age, disability, ethnicity, race, or geographic location. As of 2015, about 800 million people still live in extreme poverty and suffer from hunger. Over 160 million children under age 5 are stunted, inadequate height for their age, due to malnutrition. 57 million primary school-aged children are not in school. About 16,000 children die each day before celebrating their 5th birthday, mostly from preventable causes. The maternal mortality rate in the developing world is 14 times higher than in developed countries. 1 in 3 people, 2.4 billion, still have insufficient sanitation facilities, including 946 million who still practice open defecation. Over 880 million people are estimated to be living in slum-like conditions in the world's cities. Clearly, there is more work to be done, and it is from this vantage point that the SDGs were created. The Sustainable Development Goals. Unlike the MDGs, which are crafted by a group of UN experts under the guidance of the UN Secretary General, the SDGs were negotiated by governments in the open working community on sustainability goals and met 13 times between March 2013 and July 2014 to create this cornerstone of the UN's post-2015 development agenda. While this is inherently difficult for governments to negotiate a set of goals as concise as the MDGs, governments also had a much larger agenda. The new goals are universal. In other words, an agenda that recognizes shared national and global challenges and offers a much-needed paradigm shift away from outdated global development assumptions of the past. The new goals are also supposed to, first and foremost, end poverty and hunger and achieve sustainable development in its 3 dimensions through promoting inclusive economic growth, protecting the environment. The goals that encompass human rights, gender equality, women's and girls' empowerment, and peaceful and inclusive societies. And as often repeated throughout the negotiations, the SDGs, unlike the MDGs, are supposed to ensure that no country or person is left behind. The MDGs did not have to deal with these challenges since they focused on economic and social issues in developing countries and gave limited attention to the structural causes of poverty and sustainable development, including inequality, pollution, and resource scarcity. The result of this process was a set of 17 goals and 169 targets. Some governments and non-governmental organizations have complained that such a large number of goals is too unwieldy to implement or sell to the public. However, there is a general consensus that it is better to have more goals that include targets on women's empowerment, the environment, good governance, and peace and security, for example, than fewer goals that don't address these issues. Figure 14.2. Sustainable Development Goals. 1. End poverty in all its forms, everywhere. 2. End hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. 3. Ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. 4. Ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. 5. Achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. 6. Sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. 7. Ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. 8. Promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. 9. Build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. 10. Reduce inequality within and among countries. 11. Make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. 12. Ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. 13. Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts, taking note of agreements made by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Forum. 14. Conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and maritime resources for sustainable development. 15. Protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems. Sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. 16. Promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. Provide access to justice for all and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. 17. Strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. The SDGs were adopted as the cornerstone of the UN's new Sustainable Development Goals, titled Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, at a summit of heads of state and government at UN headquarters in New York in September 2015. Replacing the MDGs, the SDGs, and the Sustainable Development Agenda will guide development for the next decade and a half. Already, numerous governments, UN agencies, and international and non-governments are already adjusting their programs and plan to conform to the SDGs. The preamble of Transforming Our World states, "We are resolved to free the human race from the tyranny of poverty and want to heal and secure our planet." It continues, "We are determined to take the bold and transformative steps which are urgently needed to shift the world onto a sustainable and resilient path. As we embark on this collective journey, we pledge that no one will be left behind." However, like the MDGs and previous Sustainable Development Action Plans and programs, the SDGs have been subject to criticism. Some critics argue that the massive list of tasks is a recipe for failure, goals that, although adopted with great fanfare, will be quickly forgotten. As already mentioned, some are concerned with the number of goals. British Prime Minister David Cameron called for no more than 12 goals, preferably 10. I appreciate the work of the Open Working Group and how difficult it is to deal with competing demands, but frankly, I don't believe they will cut it at 17. "There are too many to communicate effectively," he said. "There's a real danger that they will end up sitting on a bookshelf gathering dust." Along these lines, The Economist argued, the number of SDGs shows what happens when a bureaucratic process runs out of control. The organizers sought to consult as widely as possible, with the result that each country and aid lobbyist got a target for its particular bugbear. Something for everyone, too much for anyone. Making matters worse, some developing countries think each extra goal will come with a pot of money. So the more goals, the more aid. In response, others have said that the number of goals is necessary, that the SDGs reflect the complexity and interconnectedness of today's today's social, economic, and environmental challenges. To achieve sustainable development, these challenges must be addressed in an integrated way. Similarly, unlike the MDGs and SDGs, the SDGs are deliberately the product of a more grassroots process, which began with input from a broader range of advocacy groups, everyday citizens, and governments than ever before. As Amina Mohammed, UN Secretary General Ban Mi-Moon's special advisor, put it, what we had with the SDGs was a paradigm shift in the way we formed an agenda. Anthony Pipa, the U.S. State Department's special coordinator for the post-2015 development agenda, agrees. The political inclusivity of this process and the breadth of the goals decided on together say that governments alone can't achieve this, that it really requires all hands on deck. This is development as a political enterprise, he adds. It requires the participation of business and civil society, as well as the political commitment of the leadership of countries. Similarly, Irish Ambassador David Donoghue noted that it was important to have political buy-in from as many countries as possible. If you were to tamper with the 17 in any way, too many countries will be afraid that the whole thing might unravel. This also reflects a nod to the integrated nature of development goals. In other words, it does not make any sense to try to remove extreme poverty while ignoring the role the environment and good governments play in building prosperity. Other critics, like Jason Hickel from the London School of Economics, believe that the SDGs themselves are contradictory. Hickel argues that the new Sustainable Development Agenda points to the necessity of achieving quote-unquote harmony with nature and quote-unquote sustainable patterns of production and consumption. The SDGs, he continues, demand halting the loss of biodiversity and ending overfishing, deforestation, and desertification. All of this reflects an awareness that something about our economic system has gone terribly awry, that the mandatory pursuit of endless material growth is chewing through our living planet and producing poverty at a rapid rate. However, he criticizes the SDGs because they rely on the old model of endless growth of endless growth of gross domestic product with higher economic productivity across the board. Thus, he argues that the SDGs call for both less and more at the same time, and he asks how they can expect to succeed with such a profound contradiction at their root. He continues, the SDGs want to reduce inequality by ratcheting the poor up, but while leaving the wealth and power of the global 1% intact. The best of both worlds. To refuse to accept that mass impoverishment and ecological crisis is the product of extreme wealth accumulation and overconsumption. Other questions about the SDGs and the 2030 agenda remain. For one, while the SDGs are universal and therefore apply to all countries, there is an ongoing debate as to what this means in practice. Developing countries consistently stress that while the SDG framework is universally relevant to all countries, the roles and responsibilities in the implementation of the goals should be differentiated with respect to the different national realities, capacities, and levels of development, as well as to national policies and priorities. Also, there are questions of financing. and the relationship between public and private sources of finance, and whether the developed countries will bear most of the cost. Another criticism is that while many of the SDGs contain elements of 3 dimensions of sustainability, the level of integration is far lower than justified from a science perspective and far lower than discussed in the preparation process. A report by the International Council for Science in partnership with the International Social Science Council states that the goals are presented using a quote-unquote silo approach. That is, they are addressed as separate elements, mostly in isolation from each other. However, these goal areas do overlap. Many targets may contribute to several goals, and some goals may conflict. Since the SDG framework does not reflect interlinkages and cannot ensure that development takes place within sustainable levels of resource at either global or regional scale, it is possible that the framework as a whole may not be internally consistent and as a result not sustainable. The new path to sustainable development. Can the universal Sustainable Development Goals be achieved by 2030? Is the planet on a path to sustainable development or disaster? While the Earth Summit set out a vision of sustainable development and established goals and principles for achieving it, turning goals into actions is much more challenging. While the 44-year period between Stockholm and Rio +20 was characterized by growth in scientific understanding of environmental problems and the relationship between people and the planet, there was just as much that did not change that still remains today. Mistrust and suspicion still govern relations between North and South. Governments still tenaciously embrace traditional views of national sovereignty, and tensions between the long-term vision necessary for ecologically sound planning and the short-term concern for economic growth and political stability still preoccupies most governments. Global consumption of goods and services has increased, but is still as unequal as ever, despite China's phenomenal economic growth in recent years. These divisions highlight the political challenges that remain, just like sustainable development issues themselves. Despite the apparent tensions between economic health, social health, and ecological health, in the long run, economic health is dependent on social and ecological health. The global economy cannot thrive in the face of the total devastation of our biospheric envelope, nor can it survive in the face of increasing poverty and disease. If we accept this fact, then there are only 2 ways to resolve this tension. We can let it continue until the integrity, the ecology, and the economy deteriorate and snap like old rubber bands, or we can make the economic, social, and cultural changes that are needed to support sustainable development at the community, national, and global levels. The Sustainable Development Goals may mark the essential move toward realizing a world where people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership come together. The universal nature of SDGs commits all countries to take action, both within their own border and in support of wider international efforts. It is hoped that individual national commitments will add up to a worldwide result that helps all people, especially those living in extreme poverty, and ensure a healthy environment. For the first time, a UN development plan recognizes the interlinkages among sustainability of ecosystem services, poverty eradication, economic development, and human well-being. However, it is comparatively easy to agree that the shift to sustainable development is necessary. The challenge is for governments to muster the political will to make this shift and for the people of the world to demand change. Discussion questions. What are the key elements of the North-South debate over sustainable development? Why are these issues so difficult to reconcile? How has the concept of sustainable development evolved since the 1980s? What are some of the tensions between the three pillars of sustainable development? What are the key differences between the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals? Do you think sustainable development is possible? Should it be a priority?